Clara Lexington felt like a ghost in her own apartment, a cavernous space overlooking Central Park where the city lights beyond the vast windows seemed like a distant, indifferent constellation. Tonight, however, wasn't about the view. It was about Theo, her bright, thoughtful 7-year-old who had spent his afternoon drawing a detailed blueprint of a skyscraper he wanted to show his father. She had planned the perfect, intimate birthday for him, with his favorite pasta simmering on the stove and a cake shaped like a rocket ship waiting on the marble island. When Theo blew out his 7 candles
Daddy.
with a single, focused breath, Clara experienced a fleeting moment of calm, thinking she could protect him from the inevitable letdown. "Mom, is Dad's site inspection almost over?" Theo asked, his fork poised above the cake. Clara's smile felt as fragile as spun sugar. "I'm sure it is, sweetie. It's a critical one." Critical. That was the word Arthur had used in his text message hours ago. A cold, professional justification that carried no warmth, no regret, no apology, no mention of his son turning 7. Clara suppressed the familiar pang of disappointment. "Go ahead," she urged softly. "You deserve the first piece." Theo's expression lit up. One wish, one moment of pure childhood delight. As the smoke from the last candle drifted towards the ceiling, Clara's laptop, which she'd been using to find a school form, pinged with an email notification for a receipt. "Your order from Celeste Atelier is confirmed." Puzzled, she clicked it open, and the air left her lungs. It was an invoice for a custom diamond necklace, a piece she had never seen. But it wasn't the 5-figure price that made her world spin. It was the note on the order for the engraving. "For Isabel, my forever skyline." The silence in the apartment became deafening. Her mind raced as she quickly searched for Isabel and her husband's company. The search results were a series of daggers, articles, event photos, and an interview featuring Arthur and his firm's star interior designer, Isabel Rossi. Theo padded out of his room, his curiosity piqued. "Mom, isn't that the lady who helped pick our new chairs?" Clara's throat tightened as she saw a photo of Arthur and Isabel at a gala, his smile wider and more genuine than any she had received in years. And in that instant, the carefully constructed reality of her life collapsed. Clara Lexington had never considered herself the kind of wife who would rifle through her husband's digital life. For most of their marriage, she had built her world on a foundation of trust, believing their partnership was stronger than the temptations that came with Arthur's soaring success in New York City's cutthroat real estate market. A world she had helped design, a world where she was once his creative equal, before she exchanged her own promising career as an architect for motherhood and the management of their beautiful, lonely home. But tonight wasn't about trust. It was Theo's 7th birthday, and Arthur's absence was no longer a scheduling conflict. It was a deliberate statement she could no longer pretend not to understand. She remembered the countless galas she attended solo, smiling for photographers while explaining he was stuck in a meeting. She remembered rearranging their entire weekends for a dinner that he would inevitably cancel. She remembered telling Theo just last week, "Daddy is working so hard to build a beautiful city for us, honey." Theo had nodded, his small face filled with a grave acceptance that shattered her heart. In that moment, Clara knew the excuses had to end for both of them. After she put Theo to bed, finding the emailed receipt had been a fluke, a careless auto-forward from his business account to their shared home computer. A mistake. His first truly clumsy mistake in a very long time. Clara gripped her laptop, her knuckles turning white. She felt like an intruder in her own living room, surrounded by minimalist furniture and abstract art that Isabel had helped select. When she found a photo of Isabel at an awards ceremony wearing a unique brooch Arthur had called an investor gift, every trace of self-doubt she ever had hardened into cold, clear certainty. "This is for us," he'd said, sweeping his arm toward the skyline. "Everything I build is for us." He had failed to mention who us really included. He had failed to mention that while she was scheduling parent-teacher conferences, he was commissioning bespoke jewelry for his mistress. He had failed to mention how diligently he was working to construct a second life, one where she and their son were merely an inconvenient footnote. For a fleeting second, as she gazed at the twinkling city, she let herself hope it was all a terrible dream. She had no inkling that the reality was far more cruel than she could ever imagine. There was a time when Arthur Lexington wasn't a stranger in his own home. Before the endless site visits, before the hushed phone calls he took on the terrace, before the emotional void became their new normal. He was the man Clara had designed her future with. In the beginning, when his development firm was just an idea sketched on a cocktail napkin, Arthur would bring her coffee in bed, and they would brainstorm for hours. He used to lift Theo onto his shoulders in Central Park, pretending to be a giant crane, building the skyscrapers around them. He used to whisper, "Clara, you and I are the foundation. Everything else is built on top of us." And Clara had invested her entire being into that blueprint. But as his portfolio of buildings grew, his capacity for connection shrank. It started with small cracks, a forgotten anniversary, a patronizing tone when she discussed her day, a new obsession with designer suits and boutique fitness classes. Then came the secrecy, the way he would tilt his phone away from her view whenever a message arrived. Clara had tried to justify the shifts, telling herself he was buckling under the pressure, that building an empire was an isolating endeavor, but in her heart, she felt herself being methodically erased from his life. He started to find fault with her choices, the boring suburban friends she kept, her lack of ambition for not wanting to network, her inability to grasp the sheer scale of his world. And Clara, pregnant with their second child, absorbed every single cut in silence, the way a woman who feels her options narrowing often does until she could no longer remember what it felt like to be his partner. What stung more than the neglect was the way he twisted reality. Arthur had a gift for making his absence her inadequacy. If she expressed her loneliness, he would say, "You need to get out more, Clara. Find a project." If she mentioned that Theo missed him, he would let out a long-suffering sigh. "Do you have any concept of what it costs to maintain this life for you?" But the real cost was simpler, colder, and staring back at her from the glowing screen. Arthur wasn't just working, he was building something new. He wasn't just detached. He had already disinvested. And as she found a short clip on a trade publication's website of him and Isabel laughing on a panel discussion, their rapport, easy and intimate, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not sadness, not fury, but a terrifying, absolute clarity. Tonight, his carefully constructed lies had finally run out of space. Theo Lexington had always believed his father was a kind of superhero, a man who built the city with his bare hands. At 7 years old, he still thought that every canceled family dinner was because of a building emergency. That every hurried kiss goodbye was a prelude to a hero's return, and that his dad, no matter how much he was away, loved him more than any building in his portfolio. Clara wished with all her heart she could keep that illusion standing for a little while longer. That morning, Theo had woken her up by leaving his latest masterpiece on her nightstand, a drawing of their family in front of a giant skyscraper. "Mom, do you think Dad will hang this one in his real office?" he had whispered, his voice full of hope. "I'm sure he will, my love," Clara had lied. His backpack was packed, with his most important artifacts to show his friends after school. A small, smooth stone from a construction site they visited a year ago, a photo of him and Arthur at a Yankees game, and the new book on famous bridges he hoped his dad would read with him that night. At breakfast, Theo had carefully laid out the evening schedule. After cake, Dad and I are going to start my new architecture model. She didn't have the heart to tell him Arthur had already texted his excuse from the Hamptons. She couldn't bring herself to be the one to demolish his world. That sounds like the best plan ever, was all she could say, knowing it was pure fantasy. Throughout the day, Theo was a ball of nervous excitement. He even used his allotted computer time at school to send her an email with the subject line "Dad?" and a body that just read, "Any news?" The minute he got home, he set a place for Arthur at the dinner table, complete with a napkin folded into a lopsided crane. The sprawling apartment, the breathtaking view, the expensive rocket ship, cake. None of it meant anything to him compared to that one empty chair. "Mom, maybe there was an accident on the highway," he said, his voice shrinking. Clara wished she could freeze that moment and protect him, but when she clicked on the email receipt and Theo saw her face drain of all color, he knew. He couldn't see the screen, but he saw the shift in her, as if a light inside her had been extinguished. His shoulders slumped, his bright eyes filling with a question he was suddenly terrified to ask. "Mommy?" His voice was a fragile whisper, but it contained a lifetime of meaning. It was the sound of a little boy feeling the ground give way beneath him. Tonight, she wasn't just unearthing her husband's infidelity. She was watching her son learn the soul-crushing lesson that sometimes you aren't enough to make your own father come home. Arthur Lexington hadn't just missed Theo's birthday. He had leveraged it for a different life, as if his own son was just an asset to be liquidated. The moment that truth really began to set in was hours before the receipt, when her phone buzzed with the text she should have seen for what it was. Site inspection ran late. Staying in the Hamptons to meet contractor at dawn. Don't wait up. Not, give my amazing son a huge hug for me. Not, tell Theo I can't wait to celebrate. Just logistics. Clara had stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally sending nothing. There was no counter-argument to be made. Arthur had made his choice perfectly clear. She squeezed the phone, her breathing shallow. She had promised Theo a perfect day, a day where he was the center of his father's universe. When Theo had asked, "Is Dad coming home soon?" she had constructed a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "Honey, your dad is finishing a very important building. He's a hero to his clients." It was a half-truth, a flimsy paper shield for a little boy who still believed his father could move mountains. But the reality of it crashed over Amelia in cold, sharp waves. She recalled Sam leaving his meticulously built Lego starships on Marcus's pillow, just in case he made it home after bedtime. She recalled the way Sam would stand at the living room window, watching for his father's car, long after she knew it wasn't coming down their street. Amelia pushed aside the memory of Marcus's promises, each one as fleeting as the foam on the Charles River. By the time she and Sam walked into the soaring atrium of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, she had brokered a fragile truce with the fact that Marcus was, yet again, lost to his work. She had spent the last hour spinning gentle stories for Sam, preparing herself to absorb the crushing weight of his disappointment. What she hadn't prepared for was the cruel twist of fate waiting for them. She never dreamed Marcus would be here. At the very fundraising gala, he swore a last-minute deal was preventing him from attending, with a different woman clinging to his arm. She never dreamed Sam would have a front-row seat to see his father's lie in real time. She never dreamed the universe would take this. One evening she had fought so hard to rescue, and burn it to the ground. Because breaking a family promise was one kind of pain. But appearing at a black tie gala with the star CEO of his portfolio on the very night Amelia was trying to shield their son from that exact absence was a different category of cruelty. This wasn't a scheduling conflict. It wasn't a work emergency. It was a calculated deception, staged with astonishing arrogance, the kind of betrayal that doesn't just wound, it severs a vital cord. For Amelia Hayes, stepping into that gala felt like entering a different dimension, one she had only ever observed from the outside. A string trio played softly near a towering glass sculpture. Champagne glasses clinked, and conversations hummed beneath the impossibly high, arched ceilings. This was a world of bespoke tuxedos and couture, a place where people like her no longer belonged. But her goal tonight wasn't to fit in. It was to give Sam a small piece of magic, a memory untainted by his father's absence. A host guided them toward the main gallery, past priceless works of art and the city's most powerful figures. Amelia was wearing a simple maternity gown she'd bought on a hopeful whim, held together now by sheer will. But when she saw Sam's jaw drop at the sight of a sprawling impressionist masterpiece, a genuine warmth bloomed in her chest. "Mom, it's bigger than our whole wall," Sam whispered, his small hands hovering just inches from the velvet rope. Amelia managed a real smile. "Well then, tonight, you're the most important art critic here." She guided him to the dessert bar, a sweet sanctuary in a sea of intimidating sophistication. She got him a miniature tiramisu, something creamy and familiar. She wasn't sure his palate was ready for prosciutto-wrapped melon, and she was determined to let nothing spoil their special night. A waiter filled a small flute with sparkling cider for him. Addressing him as "young man," Sam puffed out his chest, beaming. For one brief, shimmering moment, everything was perfect, captured in a delicate, beautiful bubble. Amelia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced around the room, taking in the scene. A famous biotech investor, laughing with the senator, a group of trustees debating acquisitions over cocktails. She didn't belong in this world of ambition and influence anymore, but being here for Sam made her feel tethered to it all the same. Sam kicked his feet under a high-top table. "Mom, do you think Dad will ever be rich enough to buy a painting from here?" Amelia's heart tightened. She hated lying to him, but the instinct to protect him was far stronger. "I think he'd just want you to have a good time looking at them," she answered, her voice soft. Sam nodded, accepting the answer with the simple trust only a child possesses. The tiramisu was a resounding success. Sam's happy chatter filled their small corner, and Amelia felt the tight knot in her shoulders finally begin to loosen. Maybe, just maybe, they had saved the night. But fragile things are not meant to last. Just as Sam scraped up his last spoonful of cream, a series of bright camera flashes went off across the gallery, illuminating Marcus Thorne on a massive projection screen. The moment the image lit up the screen, Amelia felt a cold dread crawl up her spine, a primal warning that a catastrophe was unfolding before her mind could even comprehend it. She looked up, expecting to see the museum director or the guest of honor. Instead, reality landed its most vicious blow. Marcus Thorne was there, the star of an existence from which they had been completely erased. He wasn't tired, overworked, or poring over spreadsheets, as he'd claimed in his text only hours before. He looked powerful, magnetic, and completely at home under the spotlights. But it wasn't his presence alone that made Amelia's world stop turning. It was the woman beside him, Victoria Sterling, a biotech CEO so polished and brilliant it was almost an insult. Her silver gown shimmered like liquid metal. Her smile was sharp and assured, and her hand was tucked into the crook of an arm that Amelia still considered her own. Marcus's hand rested casually on the small of Victoria's back, a gesture of public intimacy that felt like a physical assault. In that instant, the ambient sound of the gala, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, faded into a dull, rushing sound in Amelia's ears. Her mind raced, desperately trying to construct a logical reason, a last-minute networking opportunity, a mandatory appearance for his fund, a terrible misunderstanding. But then Victoria tilted her head back, laughing at something he'd said. Marcus leaned down to whisper a reply, his fingers brushing against her arm. No, this was not a meeting. This was not a professional obligation. This was a betrayal, dressed in designer clothes and put on display for the entire city to see, right in the middle of her son's special night. Sam saw the screen a second later. His small hand froze, his spoon clattering onto his plate. His happy expression dissolved, replaced by a storm of confusion. "Mommy, that's Daddy," he said, his voice a tiny, unsteady whisper. Amelia forgot how to breathe. Marcus finally glanced out at the crowd, and the moment his eyes locked with Amelia's, his confident mask disintegrated. The charm vanished, his jaw tightened, and his entire body went rigid. It was the look of a man cornered by a truth he could no longer outrun. Victoria followed his gaze, her smile faltering as her eyes landed on Amelia, then on Sam, then on the half-eaten dessert that served as a pathetic stand-in for a family evening. A flash of something, surprise, then profound annoyance, crossed her perfect features. Amelia rose to her feet, her hands feeling numb and disconnected from her body. Sam grabbed her dress, his knuckles turning white, his eyes searching hers for an answer she did not have. Across the gallery, Marcus took a single, involuntary step back. In that one, disastrous moment, the carefully managed world he built on secrets collided with the family he had tried to leave in the shadows. Amelia didn't make a conscious choice to move. Her body took over, driven by a fierce, maternal need to shield her son from the fallout of the explosion happening right in front of him. Across the room, Marcus went ramrod straight, as if he'd been electrocuted. Victoria Sterling's hand dropped from his arm, her expression shifting from confusion to outright fury. Amelia's voice was a raw whisper when she finally stood before them, shaking not with weakness, but with the colossal weight of what she had just discovered. "Marcus, what is this?" He blinked twice, a nervous tic that always appeared when he was about to lie. "What are you doing here?" he shot back, his tone sharp with defensive anger. "Are you having me followed?" The sheer audacity of the question stole the air from her lungs. "You canceled on our son," she said, her voice cracking as she fought to keep it from shattering. "I brought Sam here because you swore you were stuck at the office." Sam peeked out from behind her, his small hand still clutching her dress. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why are you with her?" Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. Conversations around them were beginning to fade. The city's elite, the investors, the philanthropists, all sensed the raw, private drama unfolding in their polished world. Victoria stepped forward, her smile a brittle, weaponized thing. "Marcus, perhaps we should go," she murmured, her voice just loud enough for Amelia to hear the dismissal in it. The rarefied air of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts suddenly felt thin and suffocating. Amelia's breath caught, but a cold, hard resolve settled deep in her bones. "Please don't stop on my account," she said, her voice a polished, chilling whisper. "Clearly, this is your moment." Victoria's professional smile faltered, replaced by a flash of raw irritation. "Marcus didn't mention you would be joining us," she stated. Her words clipped, implying Amelia was the one crashing the party. A bitter, silent laugh almost escaped Amelia's lips. "Your moment. Your big public debut. While I was at home, waiting to show you the first ultrasound picture of our daughter. Marcus, the celebrated venture capitalist, physically recoiled, his composure finally cracking under the strain. Amelia, this is not the time. But it's the stage you built, isn't it? She retorted, her voice trembling but unbroken. For the first time all night, Victoria Sterling's confidence vanished, leaving her looking utterly exposed. She took a half step away from Marcus, as if the consequences of his choices were a fire she could suddenly feel licking at her heels. Amelia felt Sam's small body shaking against her leg. In that moment, with priceless art surrounding them, a devastating betrayal beside her, and her son's world shattering, a powerful clarity washed over Amelia Hayes. It wasn't anger or even a desire for revenge. It was acceptance. This was the end of protecting Marcus's lies and the beginning of protecting her own future. Just as her legs began to feel like they might give way, a calm presence moved from a nearby group. A distinguished-looking older man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo approached them, his expression one of quiet authority and deep concern. Arthur Finch. She hadn't seen him in years, not since his guest lecture on ethics at the business school she'd briefly attended with Ethan. He was an icon in San Francisco's tech ethics scene, a revered professor whose opinions could quietly sway boards and investors, including, for a time, her husband. She recalled his sharp mind and his surprisingly gentle demeanor. She never imagined she'd run into him here, at the epicenter of her life's implosion. "Chloe," he said, his voice quiet but filled with genuine worry. "Is everything all right?" Ethan went rigid beside her, his charming smile faltering. "Do I know you?" Arthur's attention remained entirely on Chloe. His eyes softened when he saw little Noah peeking out from behind his mother's silk dress. Chloe tried to answer, but all that came out was a strangled, helpless sound. I don't know." Arthur stepped closer, creating a subtle, protective presence at her side. It wasn't aggressive, but his quiet solidarity felt like a shield. Ethan scoffed, a flash of his usual arrogance returning. "This is a private family matter." Arthur finally met his gaze. "You made it a public performance," he replied, his tone level, but heavy, with a deep, cutting disappointment. "And your son is clearly distressed." Sloane, the other woman, rolled her eyes with a flicker of impatience. She wasn't used to being upstaged in a room she felt she commanded. "Look, we're not trying to cause a scene." "No one is," Professor Finch responded, his voice soft but firm, "but a child is upset, and that must take priority." A storm of emotions crossed Ethan's face, fury, humiliation, and a clear spike of panic, as he saw how this was playing out in front of his keybackers. Noah pulled on Chloe's dress. "Mommy, can we go home?" His small voice was a blade in her heart. Arthur leaned in slightly. "If you need an exit," he murmured, "I can walk you both out, just to give you some space." Ethan moved to block them, his temper finally igniting. "She doesn't need your help." Chloe inhaled slowly, the kind of breath one takes before making a decision that changes everything. For the first time all night, she locked eyes with Ethan, her own gaze unwavering and clear. "Actually, I do," she said, "and so does our son." A hush fell over the nearby tables as everyone realized Chloe was no longer standing there alone. Chloe barely remembered the walk across the polished marble floor to the grand exit. She just felt Noah's tiny hand trembling in hers, and the steady, respectful presence of Professor Finch a few feet behind them. He was close enough to be a barrier, but far enough away to afford her some dignity. Outside, the cool San Francisco fog drifted in, a cold slap of reality against her hot cheeks. The city lights twinkled across the dark bay, their reflections as fractured as her own racing heart. Noah sniffled, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his little suit jacket. "Mommy, did I do something wrong?" Is that why Daddy made us leave his table? The question hurt more than any of Ethan's public betrayals. Chloe knelt, cupping Noah's face in her hands. No, my sweet boy, you did absolutely nothing wrong. None of this is about you. But Daddy looked so mad, Noah whispered, and he was holding that lady's hand. Chloe felt her throat tighten. She wanted so desperately to protect him from this, to build a fortress around his innocence that adult failures could not breach. But the ugly truth had already crashed their evening. Before she could find the right words, Arthur crouched to their level, his voice calm. Noah, sometimes grown-ups get so focused on their own complicated plans that they forget the people who matter most. That is never, ever your fault. Noah looked up at him, absorbing the words with the deep seriousness only a child trying to process a profound hurt can have. Chloe looked at Arthur, really looked at him, and saw a man of immense character and compassion. He had stepped into their crisis without hesitation, guided not by ego, but by simple human decency. He couldn't have known the backstory, but he understood the fallout perfectly. Thank you, she breathed. You have nothing to thank me for, he replied softly. No one should have to face a moment like this alone. Before Chloe could respond, the large glass doors of the hotel swung open. Ethan stormed out, his face a mask of cold fury, his fists clenched. Chloe, we are going to sort this out, right now. Arthur stood up, his gentle presence instantly transforming into something solid and unyielding. Now is not the time, he stated, his voice firm. Your son has had enough. Let them go home. Ethan's enraged glare snapped to him. You have no right to interfere in my family's affairs. Chloe slowly got to her feet, her exhaustion solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. You gave up that right first, she said quietly, long before tonight. Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out, not while his son was watching. Not with Arthur Finch standing there like a moral authority he couldn't bully. And for the first time, the venture capital powerhouse, Ethan Sterling, seemed to doubt the absolute power he had always wielded. The morning after the gala felt unnervingly quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Their minimalist penthouse, which typically echoed with Noah's joyful shrieks, was dead silent. He sat at the court's countertop, coloring, while Chloe packed his lunch for school. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely work the zipper. She hadn't slept at all. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw Ethan's hand on Sloane's lower back, saw Noah's crestfallen face, and heard Ethan's hissed words, blaming her for the scene. After dropping Noah at preschool, Chloe was about to head to the market when a notification lit up her phone. Large wire transfer processed. A cold dread washed over her. She opened her banking app, and the air was stolen from her lungs. Ethan had liquidated nearly their entire joint investment portfolio, leaving her with just over $1,000. The public humiliation had been an act of passion. This was a declaration of war. With trembling fingers, Chloe scrolled through their recent financial activity, and then she saw it. A cascade of extravagant spending, suites at the Four Seasons, wine-tasting weekends in Napa, charges from jewelers in Union Square, late-night car services, all within the last 3 months, all drawn from their shared accounts. Chloe sat in her parked car, the truth pressing down on her like a physical weight. Ethan wasn't just having an affair, he was bankrolling a completely separate, lavish life, with the very money she believed was for their family, for Noah's future, for the new baby, for the life they were supposed to be building. As if on cue, another notification popped up on her screen. Your credit card payment is now past due. But Chloe had never missed a payment in her life. A wave of sickness rolled through her as she tapped into the account. The statement was a laundry list of purchases she hadn't made. Designer gowns, a wellness retreat for two in Big Sur, a pair of first-class tickets to Tokyo. Ethan hadn't just drained their cash, He had secretly opened a premier credit card in her name and maxed it out. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just a messy affair. This was a cold, calculated strategy to leave her financially destroyed, a strategy she had been too trusting to ever imagine. As she stared at the screen, one thing became terrifyingly clear. Ethan wasn't just cheating. He was actively constructing a future without her, using her own financial identity as the raw material. And Chloe Sterling had just found the architect's plans for her ruin. Chloe stood before the gleaming skyscraper housing Sterling Ventures, clutching a folder of printed bank records and credit card statements. She wasn't entirely sure what she was hoping to accomplish. Maybe an explanation, an apology, or even a flicker of remorse. What she needed were answers, not for the sake of their marriage, but for her very survival. The lobby was a cold cathedral of steel and glass. Men and women in sharp, expensive suits moved with a self-assured purpose that made her feel like an intruder in her own life. She held the folder tighter and marched toward the elevators. By the time the doors opened on the penthouse floor, her heart was hammering against her ribs. Ethan's assistant, a polished young woman, looked up from her screen. "May I help you?" "No," Chloe said, her voice tight. "I'm his wife." A flash of discomfort crossed the assistant's face. "Let me just check if he's available." But Chloe didn't wait. She walked past the desk, shoved open the heavy glass door to his corner office, and froze. Sloane was sitting on his lap. Not next to him on a chair, but curled up on his lap. Her arms were wrapped around his neck, her lips close to his ear as she murmured something that made him laugh. A full, relaxed, easy laugh. It was a laugh Chloe hadn't heard, aimed at her in years. The noise that escaped her throat wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a small, broken sound. The sound of a spirit shattering. Ethan sprang to his feet. "Chloe, what in the hell are you doing here?" Sloane slid off his lap with an unbothered grace, smoothing her dress with a smug smile that made Chloe's stomach turn. "You told me she was just being hysterical," Sloane commented, crossing her arms. Chloe's hands trembled as she held out the folder. "You cleaned out our accounts. You ran up debt in my name. Ethan, what is all this?" Ethan's expression shifted from stunned surprise to raw irritation, and then to pure, cold dismissal. "You have no right to be snooping through my finances," he snapped. "That's a complete violation of our trust." Chloe stared, her voice trembling. "Our shared cloud account? The investment portfolio I helped you build? That's a violation of my entire life." Arthur stood, adjusting the cuffs on his bespoke shirt as if preparing for a keynote speech, not witnessing the demolition of his marriage. "Listen, Chloe, I'm pivoting the company and our life in a new direction. I can't have your emotional code causing glitches, especially not in my office." Noelle perched on the edge of his desk, a predatory smile on her lips. "It's time to accept the inevitable, Chloe. Some startups just fail to scale." Chloe's gaze shifted from the man who had promised her a shared future to the woman who was now his star investor. Then Arthur delivered the final devastating line. "I've sold the Boston brownstone. You have until the end of the month before the new owners take possession." The world spun. Because in that instant, Arthur wasn't just ending their marriage. He was liquidating every asset, deleting every file of the life they had created. Chloe Hayes had no idea how she got out of the Sterling Innovations Tower. One moment, she was watching the man who vowed to be her partner treat her like a failed project being sunsetted, and the next, she was in her car in the underground garage, the screenshots of his secret crypto wallets glowing on her phone like an obituary. Her breath caught, her vision blurred, and the sheer scale of it all. The financial ruin, the ice-cold betrayal, the utter humiliation came crashing down. She gasped for air, but it only came out as a choked, desperate sob. "Noah, The single name was an anchor in the hurricane. Her son, her little boy, her only reason to keep going. Chloe pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the driver's side window and finally allowed the dam to break. It was a brutal, ragged, and hollow grief, the kind that hollows you out when you discover the blueprint for your future has been stolen and sold for parts. When she finally made it home, her face was swollen and a deep ache radiated from her chest. She pushed open the door to see Noah on the living room rug, meticulously arranging magnetic tiles into a complex structure. His face lit up with a pure, uncomplicated joy. "Mommy, look! I built a whole new world." His innocent words were a fresh wound in her fractured heart, but she refused to crumble in front of him. She forced the lump in her throat down, knelt on the plush carpet, and manufactured a smile that felt like it was cracking her skin. "It's the most amazing world I have ever seen, my love." Later that night, long after Noah was asleep, Chloe sat in the sterile, silent kitchen, surrounded by automated emails, confirming account freezes, digital access revocations, and the profound emptiness Arthur had left behind. She stared at her old tablet, the screen a stark testament to his treachery. It wasn't just the affair, it was the calculated, systematic way he had dismantled their life. Then, a new email notification lit up the screen. From him. To Noelle. "London penthouse is secured, my love. The next phase of our empire begins." Chloe's hand flew to her belly, a fierce, protective motion. Arthur wasn't just cheating. He was performing a hostile takeover of their life, a swift, brutal acquisition. The man who had once brainstormed their future with her on a whiteboard was now architecting a new one on the rubble of their past. For a long, silent moment, Chloe just sat there, the sounds of the city outside fading into a distant drone. Then, a new sensation sparked deep within her. It was small, a single tiny ember in the ashes, but it was there. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't despair. It was resolve. A voice in her spirit whispered, "You will not let him write you out of the code. Not like this." It wasn't strength. Not yet. But it was the beginning of it. The next morning, Chloe walked out of their Beacon Hill brownstone, a chill wrapping around her that had nothing to do with the early spring wind coming off the harbor. Sleep had been a fugitive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw gleaming London skylines and champagne flutes, Arthur's cool voice echoing, "The next phase of our empire." She needed a strategy. She needed to breathe. As she waited in line at her usual coffee shop, a kind voice said her name, Chloe. She turned to see Dr. Ben Carter, her OBGYN, holding a reusable coffee cup. He was in running gear, not his usual white coat, which made him seem less like a clinician and more like a person. What are you doing here?" she stammered, hyper-aware of the dark circles under her eyes. "I live a few blocks away," he said with a gentle smile. "But I saw your expression. At your last appointment, you seemed stressed." I was concerned. Her throat tightened. It had been so long since anyone had truly seen her. Chloe tried to deflect with politeness. "I'm okay, honestly." But Ben's compassionate gaze saw the lie. His eyes drifted down to the phone she was gripping, the screen still illuminated with the damning flight itinerary. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice low. Chloe hesitated. Then, acting on pure instinct, she simply handed him the phone. Ben's brow furrowed as he scrolled through the messages, his jaw setting into a hard line with each new piece of evidence. When he looked back at her, his expression was severe. "Chloe," he said, his tone serious and firm, "what Arthur is doing here isn't just a moral failure. Funneling marital assets into offshore crypto wallets before filing for divorce. That's a federal crime." The word echoed in the cafe's quiet hum, cutting through her fog. Criminal. Not just heartless, but illegal. I can't afford a lawyer who could go up against Arthur Sterling, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. But Ben shook his head. That's not your problem to solve. My sister is a forensic accountant turned litigator. She lives for this kind of fight. Chloe could only stare at him. Why would you do this for me? Ben met her gaze, his sincerity a lifeline. Because what he's doing to you, especially with a baby on the way, is indefensible. Because your child deserves to have what is rightfully theirs. And because every now and then, you see a wrong so profound, you have to try and help make it right. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the suffocating pressure on Chloe's chest eased, just slightly. A single tear slid down her cheek, but this one wasn't born from grief. It was born from hope. A hand reaching out just as she was about to go under. Ben handed back her phone, his voice steady. You are not alone in this anymore, Chloe, and you are not losing. Not if my sister has anything to say about it. Chloe Hayes had spent 5 years scaling back her own ambitions to fit into the sleek, minimalist world Arthur Sterling had designed. But the day after Ben's offer, a tectonic plate shifted deep within her. It wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was the quiet, unstoppable reversal of a current. It began in the spare room, a space Arthur had decreed would be a home gym. Rolled up in the back of a closet were her old architectural blueprints, plans for a sustainable community center she designed in grad school, a project Arthur had dismissed as a sentimental waste of time. Today she unrolled them. She pulled on an old college sweatshirt, tied her hair back, and began pinning the drawings to the wall, covering the cold gray paint with her own forgotten dreams. Catching her reflection in the window, she didn't see the wife who had shattered over a secret crypto wallet. She didn't see the woman waiting to be evicted by the man who was building a new empire. She saw the architect she was meant to be. A woman who was deeply wounded, but a long way from being broken. She skipped her usual aimless walk and instead took the train to the Seaport District, to the glass and steel law firm Ben had recommended. Her fingers trembled as she typed her name into the visitor kiosk. Her voice was thin as she started to recount her story to the lawyer, Jessica Carter, but she found her footing, laying out the digital evidence with a precision that felt foreign and empowering. When she finished, Jessica looked at her with a sharp, confident smile. Don't you worry, Chloe. Men like your husband think they're gods because they can write code. We're about to show him what a real firewall looks like. Tears filled Chloe's eyes, not of sorrow, but of the overwhelming relief of finally having a champion. The counteroffensive, however, had just begun. Arthur's texts started arriving. You're being irrational. This is a strategic business move. We can discuss this calmly. But Chloe refused to engage. Instead, she screenshotted every gaslighting message and securely uploaded it to Jessica's client portal. By evening, she had unearthed a trove of digital documents from their old shared hard drive. Tax filings, investment statements, seed funding agreements, even the initial wire transfers for the London property that Arthur thought he had erased. She sorted them, encrypted them, and labeled each file with a determined focus. That night, as she sat in the glow of her laptop, she felt a soft, fluttering kick from deep within her. It was terrifying. It was a bigger challenge than any building she had ever designed. But it was progress. It was a foundation for a new life. And when she rested a hand on her stomach and whispered, "We are going to be okay," she wasn't just hoping. For the first time on this dark, treacherous path, she was starting to believe it. While Chloe was quietly drafting the blueprints for her comeback, Arthur Sterling's untouchable world began to develop stress fractures. Then, those fractures began to spread with the shocking speed of a man losing the total control he believed he had coded into his life. It started at his own company. The morning after Chloe's discovery, Arthur walked into the headquarters of Sterling Innovations expecting the usual reverence, the quiet deference his reputation commanded. But the energy was wrong. His chief technology officer wouldn't meet his eyes. VPs were having hushed conversations behind glass walls, and a stark, encrypted email was waiting in his inbox, flagged with the highest possible priority. It was a notification from the SEC. We have received a credible, anonymous tip regarding securities fraud and illegal asset liquidation. A full digital forensic investigation will commence immediately. Arthur's blood turned to ice. He knew precisely what they were looking for. The seed funding for Noel's venture capital firm. The trips to Singapore filed as server acquisitions. The massive crypto transfers disguised as software development contracts. He slammed his laptop shut. "This is corporate espionage," he snarled to himself. But the system was already compromised. By noon, the company's general counsel was in his office. "You need to give us everything, Arthur. Total transparency." The situation was spiraling out of control. It became even clearer when Chloe ignored all 4 of his frantic calls. She'd gone completely off-grid. The woman he'd promised a revolutionary partnership had vanished the instant his own world began to fracture. He sent another text. "We need to talk. Now." The checkmark confirmed delivery, but the silence that followed was absolute. His hands tightened into fists. He was a man unaccustomed to being ignored. At the same time, Isabel's profound silence was its own kind of torment. There had been no shouting matches, no tearful begging, nothing he had braced himself for. She had simply retreated. Her quiet withdrawal was more terrifying than any confrontation. Back inside the silent Pacific Heights mansion, he tried her number again. It went directly to voicemail. He stood in the grand living room he now despised, a storm of rage and dread churning within him. His control over the life he had so meticulously engineered was slipping. Then came the final humiliation. His venture capital firm's black card was declined when he attempted to book a penthouse at the St. Regis, a last-ditch effort to win Chloe back with opulence. He glared at the "payment failed" notification, pure fury flooding his veins. This wasn't how his life was supposed to unfold. He was the one who held all the cards. He was the one who dictated the terms. Instead, in the space of a single week, Arthur Sterling was experiencing the very ruin he had designed for others, and Isabel hadn't needed to utter a single word. Chloe Corbin had zero intention of ever contacting Isabel Sterling. In fact, she had dedicated the last 3 days to methodically erasing Arthur from her life, blocking his number, wiping his contact information, and deleting the endless stream of texts filled with empty promises. Chloe considered herself a survivor, not a casualty caught in the crossfire of someone else's implosion. The truth was undeniable. Arthur's life was a raging inferno, and he was desperately trying to pull her into the flames with him. So when Chloe arrived outside Isabel's stately home, she wasn't cloaked in her typical armor of a confident tech founder. She was wearing a heavy coat of regret. Isabel answered the door, her face a mask of exhaustion and surprise, only to see the woman who had helped orchestrate her personal nightmare. "What do you want, Chloe?" Isabel asked, her voice flat and cold, which was somehow more cutting. Chloe fought to swallow the lump in her throat. "I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here because you have to understand who you're truly dealing with." The parts of the narrative Arthur had conveniently omitted. Isabel said nothing, but she didn't close the door. Chloe took a deep, unsteady breath, the kind that comes before a devastating truth. "Arthur swore to me your separation was already official. He claimed you were emotionally unstable, that you had an affair first, and that the baby wasn't his. She dropped her gaze to the polished floor. I chose to believe him. Isabel's fingers tightened on the doorframe. Chloe pushed forward, her voice shaking slightly. He offered me everything, a lead investment, a new start. But then I started to notice the inconsistencies, the burner phones, the panicked conversations about liquidity. That's when I discovered he was borrowing from private lenders, the dangerous kind. He wasn't building a new future. She finally looked Isabel in the eye. He was trying to outrun the debts of his past. Isabel felt the air knocked from her chest. But Chloe had one final blow to deliver. He used your personal identity to secure multiple lines of credit. He'd even practiced your signature. And that investor trip to Singapore for his birthday? She shook her head. He was meeting a creditor, a man who made it clear there would be severe repercussions if Arthur didn't deliver the next round of funding. Isabel felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the San Francisco fog. The lies weren't just about us. They were about his entire business. It was a scam built into the company's foundation, deeper than I ever imagined. I got out, Chloe said, her voice now a faint whisper. But he won't stop calling. He expects me to help him protect his image. He believes I will protect his secrets. She met Isabel's eyes with raw sincerity. I am willing to give a formal statement on your behalf. Whatever is needed, I will tell them everything. Isabel had never imagined finding an ally. She had never imagined hearing the full truth, but she certainly never expected Chloe's parting words as she prepared to leave. Arthur Sterling is about to lose his entire fortune, and he knows you possess the key to his complete downfall. The arbitration room felt small and airless. Isabel entered, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, the other holding a file her brother Marcus had carefully assembled. The lighting from above cast long shadows on the polished conference table. This was not a criminal proceeding. It was not a public hearing, not yet, but it was the first official move. Asset division, restraining orders, and parental rights. Arthur was already seated, his body tense in a designer suit that cost more than her sedan. He pointedly avoided looking at Isabel. His attorney, a famously aggressive man with silver hair, whispered something to him as Isabel walked in. But it wasn't Isabel's arrival that made Arthur's jaw tighten. It was her brother, Marcus Hayes, a highly respected family law attorney, who followed her in. He didn't sit next to her. He took the lead position at their side of the table. He radiated a calm, unwavering authority. It was enough to make Arthur visibly clench his teeth. The meeting started. Arthur's lawyer began, portraying him as a brilliant venture capitalist, a leader in the tech community, buckling under the pressure of a complicated pregnancy. Then Marcus rose to speak. Counsel, we have bank records indicating that Mr. Sterling liquidated a joint trust account, created a shell corporation using his wife's personal information without her consent, and redirected marital assets to finance a separate residence. A heavy silence descended on the room. Arthur's face remained like stone, and then a development no one saw coming. The door swung open, and Chloe Corbin was formally sworn in. All the color drained from Arthur's face. She sat down, her voice confident and unwavering. I am here voluntarily. Arthur Sterling misrepresented his marital status to me. He used company funds, which I now understand were mixed with marital assets, to secure a lease on a penthouse at the Four Seasons. He forged Isabel's signature on the official paperwork for Sterling Innovations, LLC. One of the lawyers on Arthur's team let out an audible gasp. Arthur's lead attorney was completely blindsided. Arthur finally snapped. Chloe, what in God's name do you think you're doing? But Chloe looked straight at Isabel. I am setting the record straight. The arbitrator listened intently, taking copious notes. Mr. Sterling, this testimony introduces severe allegations of financial fraud and ethical violations. Isabel released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It wasn't triumph, it was oxygen. The arbitrator then turned to her. Mrs. Sterling, until a full forensic audit of all assets is complete, you will be granted sole use of the primary residence. Mr. Sterling's access to all shared financial accounts will be frozen immediately. Arthur shot up from his seat. This is a complete fabrication. They're conspiring against me. But his words were just static, because in that room, the truth finally carried more weight than Arthur's deceptions, and the dismantling of his life had officially commenced. Isabel Sterling didn't celebrate her victory with champagne. She celebrated it with a long, deep breath on the edge of Crissy Field, the kind that fills lungs that have been tight with fear for months. After the arbitration, she collected her daughter Amelia from preschool and drove to the waterfront park. The Golden Gate Bridge stood tall against a clear, crisp sky. Amelia instantly started searching for sea glass by the water, her joyful laughter carrying on the breeze, as if her little world finally had room to expand again. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Isabel felt her feet on solid ground. She sat on a bench, watching her daughter, allowing the rhythm of the waves to calm her spirit. The crushing weight of the betrayal, the anxiety, and the shame began to wash away with the tide. A familiar voice broke her concentration. "Figured I'd find you two here." She turned to see her brother, Marcus, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. He always seemed to know. "You're a true lifesaver," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know," he replied with a gentle smile, offering her one, "but I had to be sure." They sat quietly, watching Amelia skillfully skip a smooth rock across the bay. Marcus grinned. "She has your determination," he remarked. "She shouldn't have to need it for things like this," Isabel said softly, the familiar pain returning. But for once, she wasn't facing it by herself. "Isabel," Marcus said, his voice kind, "what you accomplished today wasn't just about a legal maneuver. It was about you taking back your own life. And Amelia's," he added. "That took incredible courage." She stared out at the bay, her eyes stinging. "I don't feel courageous." "That's precisely when you are the most courageous," he murmured. The silence that followed was a comfort, a warm blanket against the cool wind. Amelia came running back, her face beaming. "Mommy, Uncle Marcus, look at the amazing one I found." She presented a perfectly heart-shaped piece of sea glass, and then, without hesitation, she put her free hand into Marcus's. A simple act of complete and utter trust. Isabel's heart swelled, not with sorrow, but with an emotion she had almost forgotten. Hope. As the sun started to sink behind the city, a powerful realization settled over her. She wasn't just picking up the pieces of a shattered life. She was drawing the blueprints for a new one. A life where she was the architect. A life where her children were protected. A life where loyalty remained long after the deceit was gone. And for the first time since she discovered the affair, Isabel Sterling could finally imagine a future that didn't feel like a compromise. 6 months later, San Francisco looked different to Isabel Sterling. The city was the same, but her view of it had transformed. The financial audit had been an absolute disaster for Arthur. Isabella's deposition, backed by the incriminating files from the shared cloud drive, painted an undeniable portrait of his fraud. Arthur was barred by the SEC from ever serving as a company director again, his startup was liquidated, and his primary investors launched a massive lawsuit for securities fraud. For a man who defined himself by his visionary status, the public humiliation was total. Tech blogs chronicled every detail of his spectacular flameout. Former colleagues in the industry would suddenly be fascinated by their phones if they saw him approaching. In a final, crushing twist, The lead venture capital firm he had worked so hard to deceive was the one that buried him, hitting him with a judgment that left him in a crater of debt he could no longer offset with Chloe's finances. His kingdom was coated with bad data, and he was left alone in the digital wreckage. All the while, Chloe's world was quietly, beautifully beginning to bloom. She had welcomed a healthy baby boy, Owen. Her small business, a boutique nursery specializing in rare flora, was thriving. Mia was her vibrant self again, her sketchbook now a riot of color where shadows once lived. But the most profound transformation had taken place within her. One afternoon, her brother Marcus invited Chloe to a gala at the Seattle Botanical Gardens, the kind of social event she would have once found unbearable. This time, she agreed instantly. She picked out a dress the color of deep moss, a shade that seemed to echo her newfound strength. When she arrived, Marcus was there. He skipped the empty flattery and over-the-top praise. He simply looked at her, his eyes full of a brother's deep admiration. "You seem grounded, Chloe," was all he said. "I am," she answered, and the words felt like solid earth beneath her feet. They moved through the event with an easy grace, chatting and laughing. Mia, at home with a sitter, had practically pushed her out the door, telling her to have a wonderful time. Later, as they admired a display of exotic orchids, Marcus's voice grew more serious. "You know, Chloe, I never wanted to see you go through that pain, but I've never been prouder of the person you've become. Chloe, I know it's a lot to process, but you've managed to cultivate something truly beautiful from all that toxicity. A family, a business, a real future. Whatever grows from here, you're ready to nurture it." Tears pricked at Chloe's eyes. Not tears of pain, but of release, of gratitude, of knowing she had survived the storm and was finally standing in the quiet, sunlit garden that followed. She gently squeezed his hand. "I know," she said softly. Around them, the conservatory lights glowed like fireflies, and with that, Chloe Morgan walked into the next chapter of her life, rooted, whole, and finally completely her own. And so, our tale comes to a close. If you've stayed with me through this final chapter, it is probably because some piece of this story found a home in your own experience. Maybe it mirrored your own journey of rebuilding, or perhaps it touched upon a wound that is still mending. And that is perfectly all right, for life has a tendency to test our foundations in ways we never expect. But as the ancients believed, the obstacle in the path becomes the path. And Chloe's journey is a powerful example of that very principle. You do not need someone else's permission to be whole. You give that to yourself with every quiet act of courage. Recovery is rarely a single, thunderous moment. Far more often, it's the gentle rhythm of a new passion, the support of true family, the sound of a child's carefree laughter, or the slow dawning realization, one morning, that your hope has finally grown stronger than your fear. So, if this story resonated with you, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe, not to please some unseen algorithm, but to pass this message of resilience along to another person who might just need to hear it today. And above all, know that you are deserving of tranquility and worthy of a fresh start. This narrative is a fictional piece, crafted entirely for the purposes of emotional exploration and entertainment. The characters, situations, and plot points, including all names, settings, and actions, are products of imagination and are not intended to depict any real people or occurrences. Any similarity to actual individuals or events is purely coincidental. Our intent is to delve into themes of recovery, self-worth, and personal empowerment through the art of storytelling, not to portray or judge any real-life person. We hope our audience understands this story was made to inspire and comfort, offering a measure of strength to anyone navigating their own challenges. We ask that you interact with this narrative in a thoughtful way, keeping in mind that it is a work of fiction created for a specific purpose. Your viewership is valued immensely as we strive to build a supportive and safe community together.